So my name's Andy, if you don't know me, and I'm here helping out at this campus and with River Valley, and so I get to speak to you this morning. And if you're new with us, we're really glad you're here. Hope you felt welcome. We're excited that you've chosen to worship with us this morning. So this morning, I'm going to tell you a story. A little warning here, it's a little PG-13, so just letting you know, Mom and Dad. It's a story about spies infiltrating an enemy base, and they encounter a woman with a sketchy reputation and divided loyalties. Now, you might be thinking I'm about to describe a James Bond film, but in this case, we're actually in Joshua chapter 2, and the hero actually isn't the spies, it's a remarkable woman with a dark past named Rahab. You know, some stories in the Bible don't quite fit our churchy stereotypes. They don't make a cute veggie tale, or for those of you that are my age or older, they don't translate well to the old Sunday school flannel graph. If you're over 50, you can tell the youngsters what that is later. You see, Moses standing up against Pharaoh, that fits. Rahab the prostitute, not so much. We admire David for killing Goliath. We're not so sure about Rahab telling a lie. We sing songs about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. I don't know any songs about Rahab. And in fact, we name our girls Rebecca, Rachel, and Ruth. But how many Rahabs do you know? So, like the word scrolling up at the beginning of a Star Wars movie, here's the backstory. The Israelites, led by Moses, have been freed from 400 years of Egyptian slavery and are returning to a land, the land of Abraham, but a land that's also called Canaan. And 40 years before today's story, they had arrived on the borders of Canaan. Moses had sent in 12 spies to bring back a report, and two of them, Caleb and Joshua, had returned with confidence in a God-given victory. But the other 10 came back with timid and fearful reports about giants and fortresses. And despite the fact that the Israelites had seen the Egyptian army wiped out in the Red Sea and had experienced victories over the desert kings of Sihon and Og, they listened to fear rather than faith. And so the Israelites remained in the desert for 4 more decades until most of that faithless generation had died out. But now it's 40 years later, and a new generation led by Joshua sits across the Jordan River just east of the Promised Land and directly across from the fortress city of Jericho. You know, there's been a settlement in Jericho, archaeologists think, for at least 8,000 years. Today it's mostly a Palestinian Arab town in the West Bank. In those days, it's about 10 acres. It's a walled fortress city. Most of the people are warriors and their families. It could also be a refuge for the farmers living nearby. It sat on a hill. It had 2 walls, an inner wall and an outer wall. Archaeologists think that one of those walls may have been as much as 30 feet high. That's the outside wall. And then there's an 18-foot inner wall. And between the walls is where a lot of civilians would have lived, people who were merchants or people who served the warriors that lived in the inner city, and that would include Rahab, who's the hero of our story. So that's kind of the background. And in Joshua 2, the story begins with Joshua secretly sending 2 spies, and he says to them, "Go look over the land," he said, "especially Jericho." So kind of like Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible, they slip into Jericho. They're hoping to blend in with the travelers and the merchants. The mood in Jericho is edgy. People are nervous. They know the Israelites are just across the river. The reputation of Yahweh and his people, the stories of their victories over Egypt and the desert kings, these stories have gone before them, and the people are already scared. And next we read that the spies, quote, went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. So let's stop there for a moment. Why are the spies going to Rahab's house? The Bible is clear that Rahab was a prostitute, but it's also likely that Rahab's house was a tavern and an inn and a place where you could get other forms of entertainment. I always think of those Western saloons, right? The old Western movies, and there's a bar downstairs and rooms upstairs, and those floozy ladies, which, when I was a kid, I didn't know what that was for. And you grow up and go, oh, that's what's up. It's a place like Vegas. Whatever happens here stays here. It's a no questions asked kind of place. Travelers going in and out. Place where you could overhear loose tongues and soldiers coming for entertainment. In other words, a perfect place if you're a spy wanting to find out what's going on. That's why they go to Rahab's house. In fact, historians have actually found ancient laws from outside the Bible, from the Hittites and Babylonians, that targeted places exactly like this as dangerous establishments for plotters and spies. I was thinking of the cantina scene on Star Wars, right? It's one of those places. But for whatever reason, maybe it's their accent or their clothes, the Israelite spies are noticed. Someone looks over from the bar and says, y'all ain't from around here, are you? Verse 2 and 3, the king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house because they've come to spy on the whole land. But this is where the story begins to take an unexpected twist. In fact, it reminds me of those James Bond films where the villain's girlfriend takes a liking to 007 and ends up saving the secret agent man from the crazy bad guy. You see, verse 4 says, the woman had taken the two men and hidden them. She says, yes, the men came to me, but I didn't know where they come from. And at dusk, when it was time to close the city gate, they left. And I don't know which way they went. But go after them quickly. You might catch up with them. Rahab pulls an Obi-Wan Kenobi. These aren't the spies you're looking for. You don't need to search this house. And so the soldiers leave. Verse 6 tells us that actually she'd taken him up to the roof and hidden them under stalks of flax that she had laid out to dry, and they would lay these things out on the flat roof. And meanwhile, the soldiers shut the gates of the city, and they raced down the road to the river, hoping to catch the spies. So she's up on the roof with the spies, and she tells them this in verse 9, I know the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on all of us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. She tells them that everyone has heard of their God and what he can do. And plot twist, although she is not an Israelite, she wants to throw her future into the hands of the God of Israel. And this is probably the last thing these guys expected. She cuts a deal with the spies, verse 12. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, that you will save us from death. And the spies agree to this deal. They pledge on their lives that she will be spared. So since Rahab's house is built on that outer wall, she eventually lets them down through a window and tells them to hide out in the hills for 3 days, which is enough time to outwait the pursuit. In fact, if you go to Jericho to this day, just to the north are some limestone cliffs that are peppered with caves. That's probably where they hid. And sure enough, after 3 days of lying low, they return to Joshua, and unlike the spies a generation before, they say the land is ripe for attack. Verse 24, they told Joshua, the Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands, and all the people are melting in fear because of us. So Joshua, as we'll see in future chapters, gets ready to cross the Jordan and go to war. And as we'll see in Joshua chapter 6, the Israelites will keep their word, and Rahab's family will be spared. In fact, archaeologists have found the ruins of Jericho from this time period, and the walls have fallen in an unusual way. But in 1909, they found that one section didn't fall, and it has houses on it. Interesting. So there's the story, right? Great story, but it's more than just a cool spy tale. And I want us to look at 3 things to consider and apply to our lives and think about from this story. The first thing is that Rahab is an unlikely hero with amazing faith. I mean, given the culture and the situation, she's got a couple big things going against her. She's a Canaanite and she's a prostitute. And yet, both Jewish tradition and the New Testament, not once but twice, holds her up as one of the greatest heroes of faith. In fact, Rahab's courage is so astonishing that some later writers try to say, well, she wasn't actually a prostitute. She was just, kind of running a, motel or something. But the Hebrew word here is pretty unequivocal. In fact, it's used 5 times. And it's not even the word for temple prostitute, because that was part of their religion. It's the word for a woman who sells sex for money. Let's stop and think for a minute. What little girl dreams of being a prostitute when they grow up? I mean, the reality is that Rahab's life was probably one of abuse and trauma. In fact, in that culture, like many cultures today, sadly, it was not uncommon for poor families to sell their daughters in order for the rest of the family to survive. Maybe it was desperation of poverty and survival, because for a woman without land or husband in that culture, your choices were pretty slim. And it may have been somewhat acceptable to the Canaanite worldview, but it was still a dishonorable choice even in that culture, one that made Rahab despised. But it's not just her situation that makes Rahab an unlikely hero. She's a Canaanite in a Hebrew story, which raises a question. Why is Rahab doing this? I mean, she makes an astonishing statement in verse 9. She says this, I know that the Lord has given you this land. Notice she doesn't say, man, you Israelites have an awesome army. You've got cool high tech. Joshua's such a brilliant general. No, she doesn't say that. Despite having been raised with false gods, she knows enough to say that Yahweh, Adonai, God, has blessed Israel. In fact, in verse 10, she says, we've heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings, the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. That's interesting. How many times had the Israelites actually seen with their eyes God come through for them? And yet they continued to doubt and question God. And Rahab, who's only heard of these things, has more faith than Moses' 10 spies or an entire generation of Israel. It's an interesting statement that the people of Jericho were rightfully terrified of the power of God, and yet sometimes the Israelites forgot about the power of God. Rahab had only heard a little bit about God, and yet her faith was enough for God. It wasn't about the information she had. It wasn't about her command of doctrine. She didn't know a thing about Torah law. She just knew that this Yahweh was the one true God. In fact, in verse 11, she uses some interesting words. She says, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and earth below. That phrase appears 3 other times in the Old Testament, in Exodus and twice in Deuteronomy. And every time it does, it is a declaration that there is one true God, the creator of everything. She gets it, right? And sometimes people have very little information, and yet they throw their lot in with God. And sometimes people with a lot of information don't get it. See, it's not about how much you know. It's about who you know. What a contrast, the Israelites who kept forgetting this, worshiping the golden calf, being enticed into idol worship before they even got to the promised land. And here Rahab has this extraordinary faith based on a very little bit of information. But there's something even more important than her faith. Is that she understands that this God is also a God of mercy. Remember, the Canaanites were people who practiced and even worshiped with acts of rape, violence against the weak, and child sacrifice by the thousands. No wonder God says in Leviticus 18:25, even the land was defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. This is a really awful place. And yet, God spares Rahab. In fact, God always offered mercy to the Canaanites. Remember the story, which we haven't gotten to yet in our series, but the Israelites do walk around Jericho for days. They had every opportunity to make the same choice Rahab made, but they didn't. Later on in Joshua 9, we'll read about the Gibeonites, a group of Canaanites who say, hey, we get it, we surrender. And Joshua grants them not just mercy, but allows them to live within Israel. See, that offer of mercy was always there, even for people like the Canaanites, even for people like Rahab who were willing to throw themselves at his mercy. She believed that God's mercy was so great it could deliver her from her terrible situation just as much as God was delivering the Israelites. In fact, she stakes her life on it. And that's why we read in Hebrews 11:31 in the New Testament that she is a giant of faith. It says, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she gave a friendly welcome to the spies. You see, we are saved by God's grace, and we are delivered because we believe. But because we believe, we're called to act on that belief. Rahab had the courage to act on the truth. That's what really sets her apart. True faith leads to action. A person with genuine faith not only believes the right information, but that information then changes the way they live. Rahab's faith preceded her works, which proved her faith was real. Rahab's willingness to put her own life on the line proves that she actually believed in God. And that's why James writes this about Rahab in chapter 2, 24 through 26. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Right? So we're saved by faith, we're saved by grace, but is that faith real? Well, God knows our hearts, but ultimately, true faith leads to change. In the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so faith with no works or apart from works is dead. Let me explain it this way. Lots of people believe about God, but Rahab believed in God. I can believe that that chair will hold my weight. I can cite data. I can read engineering studies about chairs. But I don't really believe in the chair until I sit in it, right? True belief moves us to action. James puts it this way, chapter 2, 17 through 20. Thus also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. Now someone will say to me, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. You believe there's one God? You do well. You believe there's one God? Good. But even the demons believe that, and they shudder. See, that's the difference between knowledge and information and believing about and believing in. It's kind of like the old joke. In a bacon and egg breakfast, what's the difference between the chicken and the pig? The answer, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. Rahab was committed. She was all in, both feet in the boat, and her action proved it. That's why she's a hero of faith. Second thing about this story. You may be wondering about this, right? This may not have slipped by you in this story, and I would be wrong to dodge it. How can Rahab be commended for faith when her proof involved lying? Ooh, moral dilemma. I mean, clearly a good thing has been done. Rahab has put faith in God, and she has acted on that faith, but we can't dodge the fact that she lied. We seem to have an ethical dilemma. Can lying be a good thing? Ooh. And it's not just Rahab. Go back to Exodus 1, where the midwives lied to Pharaoh in order to save Hebrew babies from Pharaoh's executioners. And that passage ends by saying God dealt well with the midwives. We might think of some modern issues. Were the Allies in World War II morally justified in deceiving Hitler about where the landings were going to take place? What do you say to the Gestapo if they're knocking on your door and they ask you if Jews are hidden in your house? This dilemma was actually faced by a famous member of the Dutch resistance and devout Christian named Corrie ten Boom. Can a Christian be an undercover cop? Can they work as a secret agent for the FBI or the CIA? Is it ethical for a missionary to put a different profession than missionary on their visa when they're trying to enter a hostile country? What about a pro-life activist who goes undercover to record a Planned Parenthood meeting and expose the motives of abortionists for profit? Is it ethical for me to leave my lights and radio on when I leave home to deceive the potential thief? Right? So before we're too quick to answer these questions, it's important to note a couple of things. Number one, neither Joshua nor the New Testament praise Rahab for her lie, but for her faith. The Bible has a lot of stories that describe events and behaviors without commending those behaviors or recommending that you and I do the same thing. And in fact, Joshua 2 doesn't really address the lie at all. It's not the point of the text. We should be careful about basing our ethics on texts like this. We should also recognize in a world that is damaged by sin, it is the sin of others that puts Rahab or you and I in this dilemma in the first place. But in this case, it appears there are two moral principles that are in conflict. I mean, it's wrong to deceive, but it's also essential to protect human life. And the crazy thing is, if you look at theologians on this throughout the last 2,000 years, and on Rahab's story in particular, they don't agree. In fact, it comes down to three positions. So I'm going to explain those positions to you. The first position is that Rahab sinned and should have had more faith. This view says that Rahab should not have lied. If she'd had more faith, she would have trusted God to provide a way to protect the spies that didn't involve lying. Maybe she could have said, "Come to my house and look around," and pray that God would miraculously hide the spies. Or she could have just been silent. Of course, there's a problem with that, because James in Hebrews praise Rahab precisely for having extraordinary faith. That's one view. The second view says that it is moral to choose the lesser of two evils if you have no other option. In other words, Rahab's lie is technically still sinning, but it's less evil than the spies being killed. After all, the soldiers might have searched the house anyway, and Rahab would have been executed, so even her lie required faith. This view says that since we live in a sin-damaged world where people do evil, God's followers are forced at times to choose the lesser of two evils because there's no way to avoid sinning. Therefore, Rahab simply chose the lesser of two evils, and for her sin, threw herself on the mercy of God. The third view is a little different and a little more difficult and controversial. It says that Rahab actually did not sin in this case. It argues that Rahab was exempt from telling the truth. This view says that because evil people on a fallen planet act to harm the innocent, it is occasionally morally appropriate to deceive evil people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German Christian pastor who deceived the Nazis as part of the anti-Nazi resistance and helped rescue Jews as well, wrote that an evil man bent on using truth to do evil has forfeited his right to the truth. This third view would say that in Rahab's case, all the guilt falls on the evil king of Jericho. In a modern example, Dutch Christian Corrie ten Boom, mentioned her a moment ago, was interrogated by the Gestapo. And the Gestapo agent actually quoted the Bible to her about lying and obeying authority in trying to get her to reveal the hidden location of the Jewish refugees. Nevertheless, she misled that agent even under interrogation. And this view would say that all the sin of that actually falls on the Nazis, not on Corrie ten Boom. In a related matter, this thinking might also justify using lethal force, such as in the case of a police officer or a soldier. Chesterton put it this way. He said, "The good soldier fights not because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him." Of course, these cases are, first of all, hopefully rare. And secondly, you'd better be absolutely sure you are pure and right if you're going to make this kind of choice using the third option. Now, at this point, some of you would like me to tell you which view I take and wrap this up in a nice, tidy bow of an answer. Well, too bad. I'm not going to insult you by oversimplifying these things, and really my opinion here doesn't matter. Again, even Martin Luther and John Calvin disagreed on this particular issue. So if it's hard for them, I'm not going to say it's an easy one. So consider this your homework. And next Sunday, I'll be collecting your essays. Just kidding. I'm done grading essays forever. It's a tough one, right? Something for you to think about. That really is your homework. What would you do? Right? No, sometimes things have tough answers. Here's one thing you can do, though. Pray that you never have to make a choice like Corrie ten Boom or Rahab. All right, now that I've left you hanging on that one. Something to think about. But I do want to return now to the main point of the story for a third point. And it's a point, this is what you and I can live out this week. We've already seen how unlikely Rahab's faith was. But Rahab does more than just avoid death. It's much better than that. She gets a whole new identity. She's not just an unlikely hero with extraordinary faith. She's a living example that when we put our faith in God, He calls us to become a totally different person. He gives us a new identity. Think about it. Rahab was in a city doomed to die, but she is given life. Rahab was a Canaanite, but Joshua 6:25 tells us that she eventually is adopted into Israel. Rahab was a prostitute, but as we read in the genealogy of Matthew 1, she becomes a wife and a mother and an ancestor of Jesus, the Messiah. Talk about an amazing new identity. Talk about a whole new direction for her life. In fact, it's interesting. Matthew's genealogy mentions 5 women, and they're all controversial. There's Rahab. There's Ruth, who also not an Israelite, and yet in the genealogy of the Messiah. Bathsheba, known mostly for adultery. Tamar, whose story is so R-rated, I'll let you read it yourself in Genesis 38. And then Mary, who, at least to her neighbors, was an unwed mother, a scandalous situation in that culture. Isn't it interesting that the 5 women are mentioned in Jesus' genealogy? The genealogy of Messiah all have a hint or more of scandal. I think God is trying to tell us something. I think He's confronting people who think that it's my goodness or my works or my race or my tribe or something about me that earns the grace of God, that you don't know what you're talking about. It has nothing to do with that. I think what it's telling us is that God is in the business of miraculously changing lives through grace. You see, it's not that there's grace enough even for people like Rahab. It's that there's grace enough for people like me and you. We're all in that position, aren't we? We're all desperately in need of the grace of God. We are no better than she was. And maybe God's trying in the very genealogy of Jesus to say, I'm all about taking unlikely people and doing miraculous things. I'm all about rewriting stories. All about changing trajectories. Where you think you see a person and I think I see a person. I think, oh, I know who that is. I know what kind of person that is. I know where they're going. And God says, you don't know where they're going. I'm about to do something unexpected. And the whole Bible is full of that, really. Moses the stutterer ends up being God's spokesman. Gideon the coward leads Israel to victory. David, the youngest brother, inherits a throne. Peter, the Christ denier, becomes the rock on which Jesus builds the church. And Paul, the fanatical murderer of Christians, becomes the apostle to the Gentiles. I think God delights in turning our expectations upside down and rewriting our story. and giving people like Rahab and people like me a new identity and a new destiny and a new story. And that's what God offers to each and every one of us. So I want to ask the worship team to come up right now. And I want to finish with 3 things we can take home and apply this week, right? Because if you can preach it on Sunday, you should be able to live it out on Tuesday. What does that look like for you and I this week? First, I think Rahab is a reminder as a possible redemption story. We humans have a tendency to look at people and write their story in our heads based on their appearance, by their wounds, by their scars. But God sees their future healing. Let's be honest, if I had met Rahab, would I have even bothered to talk to her about the grace of God? I'm sure she was offensive to the eyes and the moral convictions of the spies. Their instinctive reaction would have been to distance themselves from someone so immoral, so pagan. And yet, they saw evidence in her of God's Spirit at work. The truth of the matter is this: we're all flawed people. Some of us just hide it better than others. We're all equally bearers of the image of God, but we're also all equally in need of forgiveness and grace. So we need to remember that as we look at others. Paul puts it this way in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 16. So from now on, we regard no one from a worldly point of view. We once regarded Christ this way, but we do so no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here. By the way, you know what's super cool about Rahab? Google Rahab. You'll come up with a lot of nonprofit organizations that specialize in freeing women from human trafficking. May God give us the eyes to see people like he does. Second application. Rahab reminds us that faith is not just mental belief, but it's belief in action. Rahab had to decide whether she would put her trust in the people around her or in the God she'd heard about. Faith always takes a risk. Now, maybe you're here today and the Spirit is speaking to you about something that you need to act on, to be courageous about. Maybe you don't even know Jesus, and God is calling you to him right now to believe in God, not just about God. Maybe you're a believer and God's been challenging you to make a new commitment or let go of something and give it to God that you've been hanging on to. As John Ortberg puts it, if you want to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. So maybe this is the time to do that. Maybe God's calling you to act in faith and believe that God will come through. And lastly, maybe you're here and you identify with Rahab. Maybe you think you don't even belong in this room right now. Maybe you feel like you are totally unacceptable to God. You're not sure why you're here today. Maybe you're new to church and you're not sure you belong here. Maybe you have a criminal record. Maybe you're an addict. Maybe your family has rejected you. Maybe you think your sin is beyond God's mercy. And I want to tell you, none of that is true. You are never beyond the mercy and love of God. And this side of heaven, the church isn't a place for perfected saints. It's a hospital for healing sinners like me, like Rahab. God has brought you here to this place to make a choice. Will you put your faith in the mercy of God? And if that's a decision you want to make, I'm not going to ask you to hide any spies today. But this is a great day to surrender to God's mercy, to put faith in God. And if that's something you'd like to do, we'd just ask you to come talk to one of us, prayer team, or one of the pastors. We'd love to talk to you about that.